Hey guys, welcome back to a Study in Truth podcast. Join Mark and me as we finish our study of the book of Haggai. So today we're continuing the talk of Haggai, the book of Haggai. We've been talking about the work of the church and applying this to the church since the house of God today, or the temple of God, is the church. And the kingdom is the church. Haggai applies perfectly to that. And we've been talking more specifically about evangelism because obviously evangelism is the most important work of the church. If we want to build up the church and make it better, I mean, obviously we need Bible classes, we need good preaching, we need things like that. But really to build it up and make it better is to convert lost souls and get them to Christ. And so we've talked about a few things in Haggai. We're picking back up now in Haggai chapter 2 and verse number 10. The application I like to make to this one is that the work of the church needs everyone. And so I'll pick back up in 10 verse, or all the way down to verse 19, and then we'll come back and make the application necessary. So he says, this is a little over 2 months from chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, on the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Haggai the prophet, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, ask now the priest for a ruling. If a man carries holy meat in the fold of his garment and touches bread with this, fold or cooked food, wine, oil, or any other food, will it become holy? And the priest answered, No. Then Haggai said, If one who is unclean from a corpse touches any of these, will the latter become unclean? And the priest answered, It will become unclean. Then Haggai said, So is this people, and so is this nation before me, declares the Lord. And so is every work of their hands, and what they offer there is unclean. But now do consider from this day onward, before one stone was placed on another in the temple of the Lord, from that time when one came to a grain heap of 20 measures, there would be only 10. And when only one came to the wine vat to draw 50 measures, there would be only 20. I smote you in every work of your hands with blasting wind, mildew, and hail, yet you did not come back to me, declares the Lord. Do consider from this day onward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, from the day when the temple of the Lord was founded, consider, is the seed still in the barn, even including the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive tree? It has not borne fruit. Yet from this day on, I will bless you. Okay, so the application I like to make to this is that the work of the church needs everyone involved. Let's see. Oh, I was making sure something was good yeah, there we go. Can you talk real quick?
Yes.
Okay, good. If you're listening, let's just disregard that part. The application I like to make to this is that the work of the church needs everyone involved. He kind of makes this interesting little, you could say, analogy or something in verses 12 through 14. What he's asking for, that word ruling that I just read in my New American Standard, it's the Hebrew word Torah. He's asking for a law. And obviously he's asking the priest because what's their job? To read the law, right? To study the law, to know it. And so he's asking them something they already know. I think this would be a rhetorical question. And so what he's asking them then is, if something's holy and it touches something else, does that thing that it touches become holy? And they're like, well, no. Okay, well, if something unclean touches something that's clean, does that thing become unclean? And they said, yes. And then he says, well, all of this is about the people in verse number 14. And I think what the application is here is that holiness can't be transferred. Just because some people are holy doesn't automatically make the rest of the people holy. It doesn't make the whole holy. But on the other hand, some people in this nation are unclean, or at least most of them maybe, if not most of them, some of them, and the unclean are affecting the whole. I think that's what he's telling them. Like, yeah, just because some of you are holy, great, but there are unholy people here, unclean people, people that aren't working, people that don't care about the work of the temple, and that's making the whole unclean. And notice it says every work of their hands in verse 14. What they offer there is unclean. This nation before me, this whole nation, he's actually including the whole nation and saying all of you are unclean. So I thought that's kind of interesting that he makes that point.
Yeah, it seems like it's in some sense kind of like a parable where you get somebody to admit the truth before you apply it to them. So he's asking these priests who would be familiar with the clean and unclean laws in Leviticus and the transfer of holiness or uncleanness, and ultimately, an unholy and unclean people can't build a holy temple, and so he gets them to admit that while holiness cannot be transmitted, uncleanness can be, and then he says, okay, these people are unclean, and so there's an issue there. There's a problem. Now we don't live under the old covenant anymore, but we do have 1 Corinthians 5, which talks about how we should purge out the leaven, the leavening influence, and particularly there was a man who had his father's wife, so that would be morally unclean, not just ceremonially unclean, like we're talking about here. But maybe one of the things when you're talking about evangelism, one of the things that kind of curbs evangelism is if you are not clean or holy before God. If you're not, to be holy is to be, a way I like to remember it in my mind is the word holy, HOLY, is to be holy, WHOLLY, like entirely dedicated to God. And so we have to be entirely dedicated to God. But if you're living in sin, or if you have some sort of secret sin in your life, you're not going to be motivated to do evangelism. I'm reminded of what David said, in Psalm 51 when he gives that psalm about how he's asking for forgiveness after he had been with Bathsheba. And he asks for God to forgive him. And then he says, then I will teach sinners your way. Sinners will be converted to you. I'll teach people. So it was only after he could be holy and cleansed that he would then go tell others the joy of his salvation, and sinners would be converted to him.
Yeah, for sure. And I like that you brought up 1 Corinthians 5 because that's the application to make is like a little leaven, as he says in verse 6. It leavens the whole lump of dough. So maybe we are evangelizing and, maybe most of us are morally perfect in God's eyes because of Christ, not us individually, but because of Christ, we look morally perfect, although we're not sinless, and I wanted to correct that to make sure I said that correctly. Not that I don't think that we never sin. But, those of us who are faithful to God working for the church, that's great. But if there are members there that either maybe they're working, but they're not living right. Maybe they are out teaching, they're out preaching, but they're not living right. It's going to affect the whole. It's going to make the work of the church even harder. Now, let's say, on the other hand, that you've got everybody morally, you could say, are good in God's eyes because of Jesus, and only a handful are working, and the rest of the people are kind of just sitting back and watch everyone else do it. That's still leavening the whole lump. Everybody has a part to play. If I'm not mistaken, I think when Rob Whitaker comes in and does his seminars, he gets everyone hyped up. Everyone hyped up to do something. Now, what that is and what that looks like in your life, I can't tell you. If you're listening, I don't really know what your role is. Not everyone's a teacher. I've met some brethren, they don't need to be conducting a Bible study. I'm like, no, it's just not your talent. Not that I'm an expert on it or anything, but other people are just better at inviting or encouraging. Or I think Rob Whitaker talks about your bringers and your keepers and your teachers. Some people are better at just being friends to people out in the world and bringing them in and letting other people teach them or whatever it may be. Other people are good at writing cards, making phone calls. That is evangelism. We may not look at it in that way, but Paul tells us that all of us have a role to play in Ephesians chapter 4 when it comes up to building up the church. Now, obviously, Ephesians chapter 4 is within the context of the miraculous gifts ceasing once the New Testament is completed. We know that in Ephesians chapter 4. But just to make the application here in this context, if I'll ever get there, He says in verse number 7, but to each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. And so we go down to verse number 11. He gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers. Obviously, some of those offices have ceased today. But he says this was for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service to the building up of the body of Christ. And so everybody has their own part to play. And it's really neat that verse 16 tells us, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, I like this part, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. Now, again, there is a miraculous aspect to this chapter, but what Paul's telling us is each of us has an individual part. And like one of my jobs, I believe, is to not just evangelize, but to encourage others to evangelize, to help people find their talent in this. Like 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2, Paul told him, entrust these things I'm teaching you to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. One thing we need to know about that verse is the word men is the Greek word anthropos. It's not aner, which is male. It's anthropos, which is human. My job is to help everyone else find their job if they're struggling with it. I'm to make evangelists out of other people. And again, if you're listening and you don't know what your job is, talk to your elders, talk to deacons, talk to the preacher, tell them, I want to do something. Because if we're just sitting around, as we see here in Haggai, I don't know exactly what their sin was or what it was that was making them unclean. As you mentioned earlier, it could be a moral sin, or it could be based on some of this context that some of them just weren't really working. I don't really know what their sin was, but they had to figure it out. They had to get it. I think you were going to say something.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know if in Haggai he's really talking morally about a lot of things. I was just trying to make a parallel between the ceremonial uncleanness.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And today, I mean, obviously we're not ceremonially clean or unclean according to the priest, but we could make that application of making sure that we're right in God's sight morally.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no matter what, what you can do, whatever part of it, God can use you. And you might be a one-talent person, like Jesus talks about in Matthew 25. They were given talents according to their differing abilities. And it's interesting that it's that one talent guy that, doesn't do anything with it. Now, all things being equal, seems to me like the 5-talent man, if he got 5 more, and God's pleased, and the 2-talent man got 2 more and God's pleased, it doesn't seem to me like the 1-talent man is expected to get 5. Right?
Yeah.
He just needs to do what he can with what God has given him.
Mm-hmm.
And in here, in verse 15, he says, consider from this day, what I'm going to do. And it's interesting, the foundation stone being laid, and maybe even the capstone when this temple is done. I'm reminded of what Zechariah chapter 4 says about this whole process and them working. It says, Zechariah 4, beginning of verse 6, it says, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. And he says, what are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you will become a plain, and he will bring forth the top stone with shouts of grace, grace. And also the word of the Lord came to me, saying, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will finish it. And you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. For who has despised the day of small things? Mm-hmm. So sometimes we despise small things, and yet God can do great things with even our small efforts. So just, kind of like in 1 Corinthians 12, just because somebody was not a prophet didn't mean that they couldn't serve in some sort of way,
for sure, yeah.
Miraculous gifts. Just because I'm maybe not the one leading the Bible study doesn't mean that I can't show concern for people, or through my life, shine the light of the gospel through the way that I live.
Yeah. Yeah. So ultimately what this text is telling us then is to be, examining ourselves, to look at ourselves and say, am I affecting the church? Your sin, whatever it may be, if there's a big sin in your life, and I mean big sin is in something you're not doing anything about, if there's something in our lives that we're not changing, it's affecting the entire congregation. And so as we went back earlier talking about, why is the church not doing good? Why is there so much drama? Why is there all of this going on? And we talked about that being possible, there being a possibility as to why that's happening is because maybe we're not working. Another possibility is it could be me. I could be corrupting the entire congregation. So let's say there's a lot of deaths occurring, or there's a lot of drama happening. I'm not saying this is every case, clearly, but what if it could be because of something I'm doing, and I'm bringing this upon the whole congregation, like the sin of Achan or the sin of David. We think about the numbering of the people, and everyone else got punished. Not punished, but they dealt with the consequences, you would say, of what David had done. And so that's what Haggai's telling us, is one little person one person could be corrupting the whole. So as we think about evangelism and growing the church, let's think about our lives and how we could better them to help the church grow. So let's move now to verse number 20, verse number 20 through 23, as Haggai concludes his preaching. We don't know if he preached after this or before this. He may have, but we have what he said before us. He says in verse 20, then the word of the Lord came a second time to Haggai on the 24th day of the month, saying, speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow the thrones of kingdoms and destroy the power of the kingdoms and of the nations. And I will overthrow the chariots and the riders, and the horses and their riders will go down, every one by the sword of another. Verse 23, on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, declares the Lord, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts. Okay, so this section has got some difficulties to it, you could say, as far as interpreting it. Ultimately, what he's saying, I think, and we'll come back and talk some more about this, but I think ultimately what he's encouraging them is you've been given authority to do what you're doing. That's what a signet ring was. If you go back to like Ezra chapter 3, beginning in, I think, verse number 10, let me read that real quick so we know exactly what a signet ring is. Let me find it here. I'm in Nehemiah. Ezra chapter 3. Okay. He says in verse 10, then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please. So Zerubbabel stands as this symbol of authority. I think it's quite interesting as you get into Haggai, and he mentions all these things about Zerubbabel as being some sort of leader, as being some sort of signet ring. I think in Haggai chapter 3 and verse number 8, it's quite interesting that he's speaking of hinting at Zerubbabel. And he says in verse 8, now listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you, indeed they are men who are a symbol. For behold, I am going to bring in my servant the branch. For behold, the stone that I have set before Joshua, on one stone are 7 eyes. Behold, I will engrave an inscription on it, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. On that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and under his fig tree. And as you mentioned...
so that was Zechariah chapter 3, right?
Yeah, Zechariah chapter 3. And as you mentioned earlier, Zerubbabel being this type or this symbol, he says in verse 12 of chapter 6, again, just don't have much time to get into Zechariah, but he also says this of him, then say to him, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, a man whose name is a branch. for he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, sorry, I can't read today. Yet it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the two offices. So he's talking about these men who are sitting with him, and he says these men are symbols. So I think what Zerubbabel and Joshua do then is stand as this sort of type of Christ, this symbol, if you will, a foreshadowing maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting that he calls him my servant here, which Isaiah talks about the Messiah as being my servant. Those messianic chapters that we're all familiar with, beginning in chapter 52, and then the very famous Isaiah 53 refers to Jesus as my servant, or the Messiah, my servant. So it's interesting that he calls Zerubbabel my servant here in Haggai.
Yeah. I think that's really neat. Yeah. I was going to look up.
There's verse 23 of Haggai 2 is where he says, "O Zerubbabel, my servant."
Okay. Oh, never mind. I was going to look up what his name meant, but it had no reference. That was a Babylonian name. But yeah, we just don't have much time in this episode to really talk about like all of these things in Zechariah. But what Haggai and Zechariah do is foreshadow the Christ. These two men are priests and governors. Governor was basically the quote unquote new king after the kings have passed on, after, what was it, Jehoiakim, I believe the last one of Judah. I may be wrong on that fact. But after that, they didn't have another king until Christ, obviously. All they had were governors and priests. And these men were never priest, prophet, and king at the same time. And so it's interesting that he fuses the two together and says this branch will come. And he's obviously talking about the Christ here. But I think like the application to make behind all of this is that God has given them authority to rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel has this authority. He's been chosen. He's been given a signet ring, or been made like a signet ring. And what God is telling him is, you have authority to do this. I'm backing you up. I think about like Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20. God has given us authority to do what we're doing. I mean, it's coming from him. You have the authority to do all of this. And God is like reminding them in verses 21 and 22, what he has already said, that I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will judge. I will have the authority to do all these things. You'll have the authority to do all of these things. And I'm reminded also of the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse number 2. He says, "Do you not know that the saints will judge the world?" And so we have been given this authority to evangelize, to do the work of the church. I was going to look up this other verse, but I just don't know where never mind. I'm thinking of something else. But yeah, so that's basically what he's saying, Haggai.
Well, I was thinking about some of these things you're mentioning. The fact that he was going to do this in the future with Jesus is reminds me, like Matthew 28 verse 20. You mentioned the Great Commission there. After Jesus tells us to go make disciples of all nations, he says, "I am with you always." Mm-hmm. And that harkens back to something he said earlier on that we talked about in the last episode here, when we were reading earlier on in Haggai chapter 2. The Lord said in verse 4, he says, "I am with you." And so God's with them in the work. Mm-hmm. But no doubt these are this promise that we find here in this fourth oracle, verses 20 through 23, kind of rekindles some of these messianic hopes. And I even think back, we didn't cover this last time, but in chapter 2, verse 7, mm-hmm. he mentions the desire of all nations. And I almost wonder if perhaps that's Jesus Christ. We know from the prophecy in Jeremiah 22 that Jeconiah would never have a descendant sit on a physical, literal throne in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what premillennialism would kind of point towards Jesus doing. But we know that Jesus right now is at the right hand of God,
For sure.
sitting as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And, from Acts 2, when Peter preaches and talks about how he's on the right hand of God, all the way through the New Testament, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 5, and several times, Revelation 17:14 talks about Jesus, sitting kind of as a king, as the right hand of God. And so this individual, Zerubbabel, is actually in the genealogy of Jesus and kind of points to him. And it's not really out of the ordinary for the prophets to talk about that. I mean, they will talk about Jesus as being David or somebody that came from the line of Jesse. And so over and over again, people that are in the lineage of Jesus Christ are, he's called by that kind of in the Old Testament as being like the one to whom all of them are pointing, whether it's David, whether it's Zerubbabel, these all point to the ultimate fulfillment of this in Jesus Christ coming in the Messianic kingdom.
Yeah, for sure. And something I also wanted to mention was in Haggai chapter 2 at verse 22. He's mentioning all their enemies, the thrones of kingdoms, the power of the kingdoms, the chariots, the riders, the horses. Daniel said something kind of similar to this way back in Daniel chapter 2, which was before all of this, obviously. I'm turning there now. I got a new Bible, so all my pages are kind of sticking together here. But he says in Daniel chapter 22, verse number 44, during the days in this context of the Roman kingdom, if you go back up, you'll know this is the fourth kingdom of Rome. He says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it itself will endure forever. And he says, inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. I think one of the coolest, if not most interesting, I guess you could say, testimonies to Christianity is the fact that it's outlasted everything, every kingdom. Every kingdom has come and it's past. Every kingdom rises up, like Rome, like Babylon, like all of these men. They rise up, but then they fall eventually. And the church, was promised to last all of these things. And what he's telling them in verse number 22, then as we go back to Haggai chapter 2, is nothing's going to stop us. Nothing's going to stop my kingdom and what I'm going to do with it. And so as Christians, when we think about doing the work of the church, and, there's opposition a lot. We have our kingdoms coming after us. We have our chariots and our riders, figuratively speaking, unless somebody is chasing you in a chariot. That's probably odd. But, we have people that are going to try to stop us. I've had it happen before. I was door knocking one day, and this lady, she was, I guess, the landlord. This wasn't here. This was in North Carolina. And she was like, "Hey, you can't door knock here. No soliciting." I said, "Well, ma'am, I'm not soliciting. I'm just here inviting people to church. Well, you can't do that." And I said, "Well, is this illegal? Like, am I No, I'm the landlord here, and you can't do that." And I said, "Ma'am, first of all, I want to ask you two things. Number one, are you a Christian?" She goes, "Yes." I said, "So why shouldn't I tell people about Well, I can't even talk about Jesus at work. I'd get in trouble." I said, "So how do you love him? I mean, would you be willing to lose your job?" "Well, no, I can't bring this stuff up." I said, "Well, that answers my first question." I said, "The second question is, since Jesus has told me to go into all of the world and preach the gospel, is this neighborhood all the world?" And she kind of was silent after that. I said it nicely, but I was making a point to her, like, I've been given authority to do this. And like your opposition, like, I didn't tell her that, but I was just trying to point out to her that your opposition is like nothing to me. Like, God's told me to do this. And I didn't mean to be disrespectful or anything. It's just like, I have the power to do this. So, and I think that's what God's reminding them, is that I'm going to be with you. And then anything that comes in your way, I will stop. That doesn't mean, let me not be mistaken for saying that the church work is always just going to be blissful and, but it's going to outlast everything that comes at it.
Yeah, I think there's both sides here to this, because obviously, God is going to make sure that his purposes are brought about in history. And he did that, obviously these prophecies being fulfilled show that. But God also encourages his people to be the instruments willingly to help do his work. Now, some of these nations that he was going to destroy, maybe they thought they were doing their own bidding, but they might be kind of like what God said about Assyria. They would be a rod in his hand or something. But we can participate with God and be blessed because he's already, started things out. I think about, how if we're applying this to the church, the foundation has already been laid. Mm-hmm. Jesus Christ is the foundation. 1 Corinthians 3:11. There is no other foundation that any man can lay than that which is laid, which is Christ Jesus. And you think about what the apostles went through in the first century in order to build upon that foundation. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 3 as a wise master builder. He built upon that foundation. But, Ephesians 2 says that we've been brought together as this household of God, and we're built upon the foundation also of the apostles and prophets. And they faced all sorts of opposition.
For sure.
And you read the first few chapters of the book of Acts, they kept on preaching, even when they were commanded not to, even when, they filled Jerusalem with their doctrine. And that's really what we need to do wherever we are, whether, is in North Carolina or here in Cerrito, West Virginia, or wherever. We need to fill the town that we're in with the doctrine of Christ as much as we can.
Yeah. And we have it made. I mean, you think about what they had back then and what we have now, it's nothing. But I think you look at what Haggai said there about chariots and riders. I would not venture to say he's talking physically in an earthly sense, because you jump over into the New Testament with the fulfillment of all this, what Haggai was ultimately trying to get at. And we look at number 12 of Ephesians 6. I wouldn't mind ending here because this is a great passage. And we think about who we're fighting against. We're not fighting against chariots and physical kings and physical horses. Our struggle, as he says, is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. So who we're fighting is Satan. As he backs up and says in verse 11, we're standing against the schemes of the devil. We jump down to verse number 16, putting on all of the armor of God. He says, taking up the shield of faith, with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. And interestingly enough, within the context of this passage, he says in 15 that our feet need to be shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. So we think about opposition and who's opposing us. Yeah, we may be physically defeated. We may be in an earthly sense defeated. But Satan, as long as we're on God's side, as far as 10 says, verse 10, we got to be strong in the Lord, not our strength, but the strength of his might. Put on all of his armor, because we're fighting the devil, and he is not going to stop us. If we're doing God's work, as you just said, the foundation's been laid. We have the cornerstone, Christ, the foundation of the apostles. We have everything here before us, and there's nothing that's going to stop our work. And that's what Haggai tried to remind them, is that I'm going to be with you. And obviously, there was a greater fulfillment in the church that he was talking about. But even in their day and time, God was going to make their lives go as good as it can go if they just followed his will.
Yeah.
So
it's really, it gets to the point and is I think a book that's needed in all times. We in our day live in a very materialistic society, and that seemed to be kind of their problem. Mm-hmm. And you think about what Jesus said in Matthew 16, where he says, what is a man profited if he should gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what should a man give in exchange for his soul?
Yeah.
We have to consider our ways. We have to make sure that we put God and his kingdom and our souls as number one priority. Just like Haggai had to tell them back in their day to have those proper priorities. You're right. We absolutely have to do that today, and we will be successful through God's help.
Yeah. I love the book of Haggai. Again, if you don't study the Old Testament, do it, because there's so much benefit that comes from it. You learn so much, and you look at these physical examples, and I think they help us apply them to spiritual things and make us better people, because we're physical people. We like physical, earthly things. And so, that's the book of Haggai in a nutshell. If you want to learn more, look up some decent commentaries about the book of Haggai. I've been reading Truth for Today commentary. I don't know if everything in there is accurate or not, so just be careful. But from what I've read of it, it's a really good commentary. And so I think that's all we have today, Mark.
All right.
Thanks, man. I think I've really enjoyed this. So thanks for being with us today on a Study in Truth podcast. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next episode. Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode of a Study in Truth podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media, or you can reach us at astudyintruth92@gmail.com. And don't forget to rate our show.